Good evening and thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the Living Hall for hosting us and to the Museums Council of Northern Ireland as well for putting on this whole series of events which where we're going to be actually doing a tour of the province. We're going to a different place every single night. So we're starting off here in Belfast, and I'm very pleased to have such a distinguished panel with us today of speakers who are not just talkers but actually doers, people who are involved actually in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of really making the change and the transition towards net zero that we so desperately need to see happen globally. Now, I'll just give you a quick overview of the topic from my perspective, and I've been working on this issue for a lot longer probably than any of you, judging by the fact that you all look a lot younger than I am. I started working on climate change back in 2000, so 23 odd years ago, when it first occurred to me that this was the predominant issue facing humankind. More important than any other, perhaps with the single exception of nuclear war, which is actually the topic of a book I'm researching and will be releasing in about a year's time. So, the thing about climate change, of course, is that it involves absolutely everyone. It involves all 8 billion inhabitants of the planet to differing degrees. It involves every single country. It involves so many different issues, and it involves the central facet of our modern civilization, which is the prodigious use of energy and largely fossil fuels which drive that. We all know the ins and outs of climate change. If you look at it from an energetic perspective, the amount of heat which is being retained in the Earth system equals about 3 Hiroshima atomic bombs worth of heat every single second. So if you're exploding 3 atomic bombs in the world's oceans, that's how much heat is now being retained in the Earth system, thanks to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. When I started working on this, we were still only about 0.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. We crossed the 1 degree line in 2015, and we're perilously close now to crossing the 1.5 degree threshold. 1.5 degrees was agreed in Paris as the limit where the international community committed itself not to pass. And we will probably be pushing past 1.5 degrees within the next 5 years or so. Now, the difference that this makes to the planet and to the planet's inhabitants will be very dramatic. I've already seen in my own work bleached coral reefs in the Maldives, where the islands have now lost up to 80% of the coral cover, which used to be these thriving, rainforests of the ocean, they call it, thriving, colourful ecosystems full of fish and with amazing different diversity of species. And now you get in the water, you put on your snorkeling gear, and all you see is this rubble covered in algae and seaweed. That's climate change. There's not anything else which has driven that dramatic collapse. And coral ecosystems will be the first thing to largely disappear. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, perhaps the most profound one ecologically, is the loss of the vast majority of the world's coral reefs. Another difference is what's happening in the Arctic. We'll probably see the disappearance of all of this Arctic sea ice in summertime, sometime over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's another thing that happens if we cross the 1.5 degree threshold. And that invokes tipping points, because if you imagine the shiny white polar ice cap disappearing, then you get a lot more solar radiation being absorbed by the ocean, which then heats up the system still further. And that leads to the emission of, to the melting of about 6 million square kilometres additionally of permafrost in the Arctic, which releases a lot more methane, a lot more carbon, and that accelerates the situation still further. So that's why we're in a climate emergency, and I know that the Northern Ireland Assembly, when it was sitting, declared an emergency in 2019, was it? 2020, along with most of the rest of the world. And that's one thing which I think we can be cautiously optimistic about, is that when I started this work, we were looking at potentially 5 or 6 degrees of global heating. In fact, a book which I published and updated a couple of years ago was called 6 Degrees for precisely that reason. 1 degree was the world we're living in right now. 6 degrees was a mass extinction unparalleled even in the entire history of the planet for the last 500 million years. And we are now, I think, much less likely to see the very extreme global climate outcomes. We're a lot less likely to see 5 or 6 degrees of global heating, precisely because the politicians around the world, the citizens have mobilised through, you've heard of Extinction Rebellion, Greta, Fridays for Future. People power has made a difference here, and has begun what I believe is a transition towards a clean energy society. The problem is it's not happening fast enough. We are probably at peak oil now in terms of global consumption, according to the IEA. We're probably also seeing peak coal. And the most extreme global warming scenarios require us to carry on increasing coal consumption right through the century. That's very unlikely now to happen because we've got renewable energies, nuclear, other clean energy technology which are now available and becoming more so every single day. So I think we can be optimistic, but we're only at the beginning of a very long journey. So I don't want to present you, as we start off this conversation, with a sense of a sort of apocalyptic pessimism. Actually, I think we can have a kind of apocalyptic optimism. But it's apocalyptic if we don't get the job done, and that's the job that's the focus, I think, of tonight's discussion. I think we could talk about the politics. You're all politicians to different degrees, working with communities here in Belfast and across the province. And I think it's really interesting to anchor this conversation in people's real lives and real experiences. A lot of the time, when I go to these COPs, Kate, you were in COP26, maybe you all were actually in Glasgow. I've been to about 10 or 15 COPs. I've even lost count. I was in Egypt last year as well. And you have this kind of global conference elite, everyone jets in. It's almost like Davos with a climate theme. And you just feel like this is so divorced from people's real lives and from the transition that we all need to be involved in making as citizens. So I'm really delighted to have you all here today. I'm not going to do introductions and biographies because I'd love for you to just to come and talk about yourselves. And that starts in reverse order. So Kate, if you could come up here and please give us 5 minutes, that'd be amazing.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. When Jonathan had first reached out, I said that I would talk about a Green New Deal and my ideas around that, and actually I've got it written out, but I thought I'll talk about something different. And I wanted to talk about apocalyptic optimism. When I was born in Zimbabwe, which is why my accent is a bit different, and I moved here when I was 12. And I've always had a real interest in international development and where I thought I would end up working. When I had graduated and moved back to Belfast, where my parents lived, I started working for Anna Lur. Some of you will remember her. She was an MLA in South Belfast and was chair of the Environment Committee in Stormont. And I remember how we used to try and convince people in the Assembly that climate change was a thing. And the idea that we would ever have Northern Ireland specific legislation was just a pipe dream. I just couldn't imagine it happening. Fast forward, yes, in 2020 it was declared an emergency, but actually where I started to see the real difference happening was in cities. It was in Belfast City Council. In 2019 we declared a climate emergency, a climate change committee was set up, and you started to see that actually it was being taken seriously, and it was being driven by younger people, but there were so many more people who were involved in the conversation and people were starting to take it seriously. Claire Bailey spearheaded the legislation that went through the Assembly, and now we have a Climate Act. When Debbie and I went to COP26, I found it a very depressing experience. It was just this jamboree. But there was one element that gave me hope, and that was the meeting of the mayors. We had this meeting of mayors from around the world, and it was actually in cities that I saw the innovative work being done. And I realized that actually it's cities that are going to drive so much of the change, and where I started to feel hope for the future. At that event, I met Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, and Steve Rotherham, the Mayor of Liverpool, and I already had quite a close working relationship with Alison Gilliland in Dublin when I was Lord Mayor of Belfast. And the four of us decided that something that we could do post-Brexit, something that mattered to everyone, the environment, climate action, was to partner our four cities together and to continue to work together. And they came to Belfast, they saw some of the really exciting work that's being done on hydrogen, some of the different work that's happening, and we agreed to continue to work together as cities. At the moment there's no assembly, and it's incredibly frustrating because we do have climate legislation, but we don't have action plans in place how we're going to deliver these targets, and it's essential we get the Assembly up and running so that we can deliver on this. In the meantime, the All-Party Group on Climate Action, which I chair, is having monthly meetings where stakeholders come together, where we talk about different issues, where we're progressing them. But we realise we need to produce something tangible. So we've started an inquiry, we've opened an inquiry into the impact not having an Assembly is having on climate action. So hopefully we will have something tangible that comes out of it. When I look at when I first started in politics, in Anna's office, and the lack of ambition or vision or acceptance that this was not something that we needed to deal with right now, I see that that has changed, and that there is an acceptance that we have to be radical in how we deal with this. People in my own party who wouldn't really have made it a priority, it's the number one issue. So I am hopeful for change. But what motivates me more than anything else is I'm also the migration spokesperson for Alliance, and I spend a lot of time in hotels with asylum seekers who are living in contingency accommodation. And you see the human reality of what happens when we don't deal with this. People who are living through unimaginable hardship, who have been through unimaginable hardship, and the devastation that that has had. As a mother, as a politician, I realise that this is the number one issue for all of us. We have to act. We have to act with urgency. And so it's so important we get the Assembly up and running. It's so important we keep having these conversations and that we keep engaging and we keep it on the agenda. Final thing I'll say is around communication. I think everyone in this room is probably pretty well versed on issues of climate action, the need to act with speed. I sometimes worry that conversation, we're not breaking through, we're talking to each other, we talk in a language that is not always accessible. Really, climate action is the most important issue to every single person on this planet, and we need to start talking about it in a way that is completely accessible so that politicians like myself act with the urgency that is required. So looking forward to the rest of the conversation and what you think about what we need to do.
Thank you. Well, talking about making climate change accessible and relevant to ordinary people is probably a good place to bring you in, Debbie.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. It's really nice to be here tonight, and so thanks very much for the invitation. And Mark very kindly got my age wrong. I'm actually a lot older than he thinks, because I actually started off probably the same time as yourself, working in climate change when I was working in Bangladesh, and I was working in the coastal zone, and I saw firsthand how it was impacting on poor coastal communities there, and how vulnerable they were, but also how much the government and the NGOs were actually doing to combat climate change in terms of adapting to climate change, and I would say they're way ahead of where we are as a country in terms of adaptation, because they're developing salt-tolerant varieties in the coastal zone and so on. So my role really came into being really as a result of the leadership that was shown at Council, and across the country you'll probably see that councils really have led the way, and I think everyone would agree with that councils are sort of like leading the way in terms of setting targets and so on, and then we've got the national legislation sort of catching up afterwards. And so my role came into being about 2 years ago, and I was hired as the Climate Commissioner, which is a very grand title, really. But my role essentially is to really support that transition to an inclusive, resilient, net zero economy. And I see that really as kind of trying to help our kind of colleagues and partners in central government and across the city in terms of delivering on Northern Ireland's commitments, and it's under the climate legislation, and also those strategies, those great strategies that we've got now, the energy strategy and green growth strategy. It's because local is really where the rubber hits the road. So, I mean, it's great to have the legislation, it's great to have the strategies, but they actually all get rolled out in place. So place-based approaches are really, really important. So we're trying to do our bit as a city, because cities are actually responsible for around 70% of the emissions across the world globally. So we've got our city targets now, which we've committed to. And local authorities are also really, really key in unlocking the kind of environmental, social and economic benefits of the transition as well. And we shouldn't forget the opportunities that are going to come from the transition. And we need to be a bit more positive, I think, about all those opportunities. So when I first came in, I started talking to lots of other cities and other local authorities, and I said, how do you actually do this? How do you transition a city? And I got all these kind of ideas, and I looked at all these kind of action plans. And what I could see across most of these action plans was that normally you end up with about 130, 140 different actions, and you end up with this really disparate approach to climate action, and you actually don't get very far. It's because you're just sort of incrementally moving along 150 different fronts. So what we're trying to do in Belfast City Council is kind of focus on the really strategic, transformational kind of investments that are going to do that heavy lifting and help us along with that transition. So it's kind of 4 key moves as I see it in Belfast. So the first thing is we've got to kind of bring down our emissions. And for Belfast that means buildings and transport, because that's where most of our emissions are coming from. And so, we're way too reliant on fossil fuels for our energy supply. We're spending over 230 million every year just like heating the sky, essentially. And we've got to make our buildings way more energy efficient. So that's why we're trying to develop a local area energy plan for the city over the next year that will come up with a coordinated series of investments which will show us the most cost-effective way to kind of decarbonise across the energy systems, that's building, transport, industry, etc. And we're also trying to set up a kind of district heat network as well, and try to electrify at the kind of district level rather than trying to put heat pump onto lots and lots of little terraced houses, which I think would meet huge resistance over. We will try and do that at scale, so try and do one large heat pump, maybe using a water source heat pump on the Lagan or geothermal. We're just about to do a feasibility study, so that's all up in the air at the moment, but we're very keen to do that. And we've got around 35 building operators that are already really, really keen to kind of work with us, and they're all public buildings, and that represents about 15% of the total heat demand for the city. So that would be a really transformational project for the city. We're also doing an electric vehicle infrastructure strategy for the city, and we're looking at how we can kind of look at the solar PV potential for all the flat roof space that we've got across the city as well. I think the second key move we've got to do is we've really got to start sweating the city assets. And by that I mean the land, the rooftops, all the assets that we have as a city. Because essentially we're trying to electrify heat and transport, and the grid can't actually cope with that at the moment because we've got a one-way grid that takes, from coal-fired or oil-fired or gas-fired power stations into our homes. And essentially, we can't really utilise all the renewable energy that we generate. So we need way more flexibility, we need to make way more storage. And so we need to kind of use the land that we've got and the rooftops that we've got to host solar PV and hydrogen electrolyzers, battery storage, pumped hydro. Those are all the things we've got to do. And the third key move is really we've got to innovate. We've got to innovate our way to net zero. And because we don't, we're just going to get left behind. Because all the other countries have recognised that there's a massive opportunity here, because we're in the middle of a global transition and there is a technology race on. And we're actually really, really well placed as a city to do that, because we've got 2 world-class universities, we've got a brilliant history of manufacturing and engineering that we can leverage on, and we've already got a really, really strong cluster of net zero technology companies like Catagen and Artemis that are building the electric ferry from Bangor to Belfast that's starting next year. So we want to grow that cluster because those companies are creating great apprenticeships with Belfast Met, and they're doubling every year in size. We want to grow that cluster and bring more companies in to do that in Belfast. And the last piece of the jigsaw, the fourth key move, is finance. Because the UK Climate Change Committee reckons it's going to cost Northern Ireland about £2.2 billion per year to actually decarbonise and reach its net zero targets. That's a huge number. And you can say, well, that's a massive cost. You can look at that in a really negative way, or you can see it as an opportunity. It's a massive investment opportunity, and I know the investment community, that's the way they see it, and they're really, really keen to invest. So we need to unlock that opportunity and de-risk that. So we're having discussions with representatives from the finance community at the moment on there. So I feel really positive about the opportunity from the transition. And I'm just keen to kind of hear what everyone else is saying, and thanks very much for the opportunity tonight.
Well, thanks, Debbie. Thanks. One of the things about being old, and I guess you will recognise this then, Debbie, is that how the whole climate change narrative has changed. Like when I first started doing climate talks and events, it was all about reducing, had to give stuff up. It was all a very kind of gloomy, negative sort of feel about the whole thing. And now you're using words like innovation, opportunity, investment, and it's there's a competition, there's a race on that. The US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, is spending $1/3 trillion, I think, on supporting this transition to clean energy. And they want to be first in hydrogen and electrolyzers, they want to be first in the district heating, they want to be first in the electrification of surface transport, all this sort of stuff. And you're saying, well, actually, we want to be in the race too. We want to be the global centre for these things, and we maybe already are in some areas. So that's what I mean. It's a much more inspiring picture than perhaps what we used to have. Anyway, Amanda, I'd love to hear from you, and then we'll go to a broader discussion and bring you all in as well, because I'm sure you've got lots of interesting questions and contributions.
Thanks, Mark, and glad to hear you refer to the inspiring nature of what we're facing now in terms of climate action, and that's what I'd like to talk about now, is a bit about the inspiration we can see across Northern Ireland when it comes to climate action and how we're influencing policy and legislation. So you heard earlier that I am a sociologist, I'm an educator. I'm also, I've been involved in various climate initiatives over the years. Co-founded the Belfast Climate Commission, which Debbie co-chairs. I was chair of Climate Coalition Northern Ireland for 2 years. I'm director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action in Queen's. And I've been involved in various research initiatives focused on multi-level climate action, looking at the socio-ecological dimensions of action. But perhaps more importantly, I have been involved in community work for over 20 years. I've worked with a wide range of communities across this island, focused on addressing inequalities and making our communities a better place to live. And that's what I want to focus on in terms of the legislative and political context, is that change has been driven by our communities, and they need to be first and foremost in all action that happens. So it was great to hear Kate's input into how we've developed the legislative context in Northern Ireland, and I'd like to add to that a little bit. As chair of Climate Coalition Northern Ireland, we have evolved as the largest civil society network in the north. When I took over as chair in 2020, the Assembly had just declared a climate and ecological emergency. New Decade, New Approach had committed to climate legislation. But coincidentally, on the day that I became chair of the coalition, the minister responsible for climate action stood up in the Assembly and refused to take forward a motion that had been passed by the Assembly calling for an urgent climate act. So we had the Assembly saying that we want urgent climate legislation, and the minister saying no, he wasn't going to do it, it was impossible, it was ridiculous, not going to happen. So we in civil society thought, well, actually, this has to happen. We've heard tonight all the reasons why we need urgent climate action. And in our coalition, it was really clear that our politicians weren't going to take the action then that was needed. So if we look at the history, the trajectory of field climate action in the north, we go back to 2008, the inquiry into climate change that recommended targets, that pointed towards legislation, nothing came out of that. We look at recommendations from the UK Committee on Climate Change, we looked at advice given to the Assembly, we had various movements across the decades, but nothing happened. Even when we came to the point of a declaration in the Assembly, there still was strong resistance towards climate legislation. So we in Climate Coalition Northern Ireland, as a community of interest, we came together for climate action. We decided to see what we could do about it. So those of you who are unfamiliar with the coalition, we are a large organisation that includes environmental NGOs, community groups, students, academics, farmers, businesses, and other groups. And collectively our member organisations represent about 400,000 people across Northern Ireland. And so we began to drive forward a movement for climate legislation. And in doing so, we began to talk to independent legal experts to say, can we put forward climate legislation in the absence of political leadership? And the independent legal experts said, yeah, we can. And we decided to talk to our politicians, who obviously are key to bringing forward legislation. And Kate talked to Claire Bailey, spearhead the movement. But Claire was one of 9 MLAs that we worked with who co-sponsored Northern Ireland's first climate change bill that came from civil society. They came from a community of interest. They came in the absence of political leadership. And this is what I want to talk about, is communities. You know, we finally have a climate change act that came from communities, it came from the grassroots up. But what I often don't hear enough about is how do we ensure that communities are central to every single aspect of transition? Because we know that climate action can't happen without communities. We can't move towards a better future unless we're all involved. So how do we enable climate action that entails the legislation and the policies and imperatives that Debbie and Kate have talked to, but bring everybody around with us from a grassroots up perspective as well as a top-down perspective? And I think in Northern Ireland, you know, we often hear about community in quite a derogatory way. We kind of use it as a way to distinguish one group from another. Sometimes we hear about, you know, distinguish between Catholic communities, Protestant communities, other communities. But it doesn't matter what our religious affiliation is, or what our affiliation to any nation states is. We're all human beings sharing this one planet. We all have a responsibility to take climate action, and we can all undertake climate action in different ways. So I think our work in Climate Coalition in Northern Ireland, I think, is a really exciting precedent, an inspiring precedent that shows what can happen when we, at a grassroots level, come together to work with our politicians, to work with experts in different areas, to set forward a precedent and a movement that otherwise would not have happened. And we can see other examples of our communities are leading the way, whether it's growing food production, whether it's community energy schemes. We're seeing evolutions towards eco-villages across the island. This is where action needs to happen. And we also have to ensure that our communities are brought with us and the policy and legislative framework. Often policy is decided by politicians and civil servants, and communities are often left behind. And Debbie, I thought it was really interesting you were talking about some of the resistance we might face in terms of individual heat pumps and individual retrofits. You know, I think that if we take a different perspective and we start with communities first, we get communities to buy in, that's going to overcome resistance. That's what's going to help people buy in to the transition that's necessary. So that was some of my opening thoughts about communities have to be central to action. In Northern Ireland, we have a chance to overcome contentious politics around community. We can co-create new communities for a better future and move towards a more peaceful, healthier society for all of us. Thanks.
Thanks, man. I'm going to go back up here so we don't have 4 people fighting over 2 microphones. But you brought it back sort of, you've got this contrast between the local, the community level, and the national, provincial, if you like, the assembly level. Are you able to make up for the fact that the assembly isn't sitting? I mean, is there enough to do at the grassroots which can actually keep the momentum on the climate transition?
Well, absolutely. That's where change happens, is at the grassroots. Whether it's the retrofits that Debbie has referred to, that involves people in our homes and our streets and our communities. Those changes can't happen without communities being involved. We can't reduce our own individual and collective emissions unless we in our communities take action. So whether it's decide we're going to engage more in active travel, we're going to use a car less, we're going to engage in car sharing, we're going to fight for better cycle and active travel infrastructure. There's so much that can be done in communities. But communities have to be heard and be recognised as key partners in the transition. We can't leave it to big business, we can't leave it to politicians. No offence, Kate, you're an amazing politician. But we can't leave it to others. We all have to be part of this transition, and we don't have to wait for... The Climate Act was a great achievement for civil society. It wouldn't have happened, okay, obviously without the politicians that were involved, but it wouldn't have happened without civil society. I think we would still be sitting without an act for Northern Ireland if it was left to some of the politicians who were responsible for it. But in the absence of the Assembly, there's a lot more we can do and should be doing. And communities have to be held as central to all actions.
Mm-hmm. So Kate, give me a sense, I'm an outsider obviously, I come from Wales at the moment, although I was born in Fiji, so who was born in Zimbabwe? Was that what you, wasn't it? Yeah, so we're all sort of foreigners and locals in a different way, but give me a sense of how the politics of climate change works here. Like, I sort of fondly imagine that it's something that the DUP and Sinn Féin all agree on. Everyone agrees that we're in a climate emergency and we should all work together, and you know, it's a kind of cross divides type thing. Is it that nice or not?
No. Yeah, Amanda, I didn't give you credit. What the community have done, she's completely right. This is community driven, and in so many, everything progressive in Northern Ireland, any progressive change happens because the people are pushing the politicians up the hill. We don't have the Green Party councillor Malahar keep mentioning Green Party politicians, we stop mentioning my own, but he had this really brilliant phrase about how we've gone from climate denial to climate delay. So it feels like, yes, everyone knows it's no longer socially acceptable to say there isn't a climate emergency, and all politicians have agreed that action is needed, but some people are just a bit more kind of genuine than others. So I think there are people within the DUP, I'm sure, who would like to see more action. But there are quite a lot of them who I don't think really care. So I think the climate delay is the real political problem, and actually it's one of the ones I'm most worried about, because at least when you know what you're dealing with when people are denying, when they've got a problem with it, but the fact that kind of lip service is paid to it, that makes me worry. And so I think that kind of the motivation and the pressure from community is so important, because it keeps it on the agenda. When I was Lord Mayor, I had a monthly environmental challenge, and it's not because I think it's important we all do a bit for the environment, but I'm not blind to the fact that actually any change comes from government and business. It was more that if I was cycling to work and if I was talking about these, we went plastic free, Debbie and I, 1 month. If we were talking about it, it was getting communities to talk about it, and if communities were talking about it, then it was on the agenda for politicians to take action. So yeah, I completely agree with what you say, and we need more of that.
Yeah, I mean, one of your jobs is chairing the all-party group on climate. So that presumably means at a day-to-day level, you're trying to bring the different parties together. What do you try and get done? What does it do?
Bringing the different parties together, but also the expertise. Politicians don't know very much about like a lot of things in detail. We rely on the experts who do. And if you believe in evidence-based policy, which I do, then I need to listen to the experts who know about this. So the all-party group is a means of bringing politicians and stakeholders together to discuss the important issues, to keep them on the agenda, and to hopefully inform policy when the Assembly is up and running. In the absence of that, I mentioned we're doing an inquiry on the impact that is having on climate. It really is a means of bringing that evidence and that expertise into the forum.
And Debbie, I mean, it's like you can talk about. We have a plan for a net zero. There's a net zero Belfast plan, right? Which I think Amanda was probably involved in writing as well. How can you go net zero as a single city? I mean, people are driving their cars around. You can't invent whole new technology just for a single city. So what can you do? What are the levers that you can actually pull? You mentioned district heating and a few other things, but I mean, can you actually do enough to get to net zero?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, that report you mentioned was so transformational for us. So thank you so much for getting it off the ground, because it's a constant reference document, but it actually gives you the data and the evidence base on which to work. So we know that our emissions are coming from buildings. We know by 2050, 70%.
Like directly from buildings, from actual boilers, like gas boilers and buildings.
Gas boilers, and this is just scope 1 and 2 emissions. But like, if you've got to start somewhere. But buildings is the nut that we really have to crack in this city. It's different in other cities, but you've got to start somewhere. So like the district heat one,
which means digging up the roads. You're going to have to lay pipelines, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we need to take that opportunity to look at how we can build resilience in as well. So we can like put sustainable urban drainage in at the same time. We have a bolder vision for Belfast City Council as well, which is a partnership with DFC and DFI, where we're just trying to kind of reimagine the city centre, want more people to kind of move into the city centre, so that we haven't, at the moment it's like this hollowed out donut, where you just have loads of cars, usually one person in, just commuting in. So what we want is for people to actually live in a city centre, like they do in a lot of European cities, and live and enjoy the city centre, green up the city centre, make the city centre a nicer place to be, pedestrianise some areas, dare I say it. But do things like that, increase the kind of like cycleways, and so people can actually walk, so people then don't have to get in the car. So we need to make that modal shift easy for people. So we have to kind of bring people along with us. So, but everything council does has to be done in partnership with central government and communities, because actually councils in Northern Ireland don't have very much power. So we're not the transport authority, we're not the housing authority, as we might be if we were an English council. So everything is done in collaboration with central government and communities. So that does sort of require additional resources to kind of work at that level, and it's been quite challenging. I'll give you an example. Like when you look at all the funding that's available for electric vehicle infrastructure, it's made available from Westminster. It's designed for English councils because they are the transport authority, so it's all channeled through councils. Whereas, so when it comes to Northern Ireland, it has to be channeled through a council, but it then has to be a partnership with DFI as well. So because we don't own the pavements and we don't own the lampposts, so there's an extra layer of complexity because of being simply because of the way things are kind of structured.
Can you make sure it's integrated? As an electric vehicle owner, one of my real gripes is the lack of integration in the system. You have to have a different app, and your swipe card doesn't work, and the little light goes red, and you've got to phone a helpline when no one answers, and it's just in the middle of the night when it's raining. It's not being made easy.
No, it's not.
The electric vehicle revolution.
Yeah,
so there's probably whoever's in authority.
And that's the issue, because that's DFI that kind of are putting all that together, and they are doing their best, and there is an EV task force, and they are kind of looking at it, but we are going way too slowly. Even across the whole of the UK, it's just moving, and the Republic, it's just moving too slowly, and it's putting people off buying electric vehicles. But hydrogen is the other one. So for heavy goods vehicles and trucks and buses, hydrogen is an option. So that's one of the great things that came out of that visit to Glasgow, and the statement of intent that was signed with 4 mayors, is that we've got now a really close working relationship with Liverpool. So we're trying to look at that interoperability so that we don't make the same mistakes. So that if we have a hydrogen refuelling station in Belfast, it looks the same as what it does in Liverpool. So that when trucks get off and they refuel, because you have more range with hydrogen fuel cell, you could refuel at that one place down in the harbour, and you could get anywhere in Northern Ireland in your truck and back again. So just those sorts of things can be quite transformational. And
maybe
as well.
ferries. I came up on the ferry from Liverpool, and that stinking heavy fuel oil really is quite. I mean, it's pretty polluting stuff, isn't it? So, and we're a long way, as far as I know, from any kind of clean alternative for shipping. So
we were at the Maritime Awards in Liverpool, and with Ian Percy, who heads up Artemis here, and.
What's Artemis?
Artemis is they're developing an electric ferry and workboats to go out to the wind farms, and it comes up onto like this kind of really neat kind of hydrofoil, it's called. So it actually kind of it's developed from sailing technology, and it goes through the water really fast. There's no wake basically, and there's no resistance, and it's 85% more efficient, and it's electric, so it's totally net zero. And these are sort of being shipped all around the world. And we were in Liverpool, and we heard that Liverpool had just bought a load of diesel ferries for their Mersey on the Maritime. So he was a bit cross, and so we were trying to look into that when we got back. But that's why we're trying to kind of promote those types of companies that are doing this sort of groundbreaking work in Belfast, because we want Liverpool to buy those boats. We want Glasgow to buy those boats.
Can we have some in the Maldives as well? I mean, I work there.
Why not?
I know it sounds like a lovely job, but actually it's a hellish place to have to go all the time because it's really hot in the Maldives, I'm talking about here. And you go between all the islands on these motorboats, which are these horrible diesel things that roar through the water and burn about a litre a minute. So it sounds ideal. So I think there's going to be a huge market. All the small island states are going to want these. So if you can, get that market. Yeah. I'm buying shares. Go ahead.
It's something to be proud of. I think so often in Northern Ireland we're so kind of despondent and down on ourselves in terms. People are very self-deprecating here, which can be really lovely, but is not ideal when you're trying to improve kind of opinion of yourself and self-confidence. And there is really exciting work that's happening. What Ian's doing. They're really amazing businesses, so we'll definitely hook you up with them, but also it's something that we should be promoting more as well and encouraging.
What about could you go back to the communities thing? I know you worked a lot on just transition. I happen to think, I'm living in Wales at the moment, I happen to think the coal miners were not well treated. And how can we make sure that communities who are losing out in the clean energy transition can be part of the journey and can be, the issue of justice can be front and centre?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, terrible point actually in a lot of ways. when we think about what communities have been facing. So we think about Wales and the experience of coal miners. We think about here in the island, communities in the Midlands who have been worked in peat and producing peat, and these peat farms have been closed down, and there has been traditional plans developed, but these have been developed without communities. These have been developed often with politicians, with some self-servants, maybe some engagement with who they determine as key stakeholders, but there's often not enough actual attention to speaking to people on the ground. What are your issues? What are your fears? What are your concerns? What do you want to see happen in your area? What would alternative employment look like for you? What would sustainability in your area look like for you? How can we co-create that? And that's where we need to begin, is in communities, listening to communities, talking with communities, building plans with communities, with the commitment to just transition principles, which includes the commitment to leaving nobody behind. And we have particular issues here in Northern Ireland if you look at the high levels of deprivation across the region. And we also know in a publication that the Belfast City Council has put out that around 27% of houses, most at risk of flooding in the north, are in deprived areas. So we're already in a context where our most marginalised communities are likely to be left behind, and we have these poor precedents of so-called transitions where people who are dependent on fossil fuels for employment are being left behind as well. So I think I often talk about community work principles, which are about inclusion, participation, respect, and social justice, and bringing people together to change, to affect change at local level. People have to be part of the change. They have to be involved in every aspect of change, and that's not happening in Just Transition. And what any of the so-called things have been described as Just Transition to date.
Yeah, and it's not just cities. It's it's rural areas. Farming is going to have an enormous challenge. I mean, I've spent half the day looking for vegan alternatives in Belfast, and one of the reasons I try and have more vegan food is because livestock emissions are it's up there with transport essentially, particularly if you take into account all the deforestation around the world and so on. And you look at livestock farmers. I was working with Rewilding Britain, and I'm an advocate of rewilding as well in the UK. And we drew this big zone on the map of central Wales, that this is going to be our rewilding focus, we're going to get money in, and there was a revolt. All of the farmers were against it, posters started going up everywhere saying no to rewilding, and we were basically, kicked out of the area. And that's how to get it wrong, right? Because it was something which was imposed from top down. We drew a boundary on the map and said, you're inside, without any consultation. And people, not surprisingly, were really offended and felt very threatened by it. But it's a transition that is going to happen and does have to involve. So, what would best practices look like?
Well, one certain point is to go beyond consultation. That's seen as the bare minimum that you consult. Whether it's, we often see here, things will go out online for 8 weeks, you'll be told to fill out a form, that's your consultant done. Yep, you've had your say. We see it over the climate legislation. When the minister put out his own separate climate bill, he had an 8-week consultation, and that was it. That was seen as consultation. That's not how you do participation. You have to go in to these areas. You have to build relationships with people. You have to listen to people and be open to not having predetermined ideas about what the solution is going to look like. You have to co-create solutions. And a lot of people can't get their head around that because it's so different to how we normally do policy or politics generally. We were so used to electing people and then they'll make decisions on our behalf. We have to move away from that. We have to have genuinely participative democracy, and those practices have to be employed at a local level to affect change from the grassroots up. And it has to be reflected in policy and legislation as well. That commitment to change and to actually creating space for people to participate and co-create solutions.
Well, I wish we'd had you involved. Coming up with that project. Now it's coming up to 7 o'clock, and I'd love to involve everyone here in the discussion. So we don't have a microphone, but we don't probably need one. It's a fairly small room, so feel free just to raise your voice. Anyone got a question or contribution of any sort? Yeah, gentleman there.
Right. What if local communities just say no? People just say no. They don't want to do this. They keep wanting to drive their cars.
Well, and does that happen? I mean, is that something you've come across in reality?
No, I haven't come across that. And I think that if you actually take this time to speak to people. Now, I'll give an example with the climate legislation. You've talked about livestock, and we know that in the north, one of the largest source of emissions is from agriculture. So people will say, well, then all farmers are against climate action, and that's not actually true. It's far from the truth, actually. A lot of farmers want to actively drive climate action. They want to take action at local level. And we found with the Climate Coalition and through subsequent research and projects I've been involved in since, when we create a space to talk to people, we can find out what works in your area, what can work better for you. So one example might be we're seeing some farmers come together to set up a cooperative to co-create local energy to reduce their emissions, to reduce their dependency on imported fuels. So we can't have one size fit all approach. No, but it'd be great to say, we'll go into community and say, a rural community, and say, well, you have to shut down all your production, you have to stop using your tractors, we want to see bicycles, we want to see all of that. That's not going to work. We have to talk to people about what works for them and engage and prepare to engage long term. If people are saying no, why are they saying no? How can we make things more accessible to people, find out what the issues are, and how can we support them to find solutions that are acceptable to them? So I haven't seen, sorry.
Thank you, that answers the question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I always get very nervous when I hear the word communities bandied about, because I think people sometimes mean different things by community. Some people mean community groups, and I agree there's a lot of community groups that do really good work that's contributing to climate change. Other people, and I think Debbie was doing this, are actually talk, when they say communities, they mean people who live in a certain area. And there's a difference between that, and I think there is a point about how you talk to people who don't normally come to community, aren't part of community groups, they don't come to community meetings, and yes, they are resistant to change. And I think that's the difference between, if you're a campaigner, you're probably working with people who really want to go with the flow. And if you're working for the council or if you're working in the assembly, you're very aware of the people who come and shout at you because it's harder for them to use their cars or they don't want a heat pump or whatever. How you actually get down to communicating on a long-term basis with people who don't want to change, I think is really difficult. You almost need sort of a climate advocate in every street or something like that. And on that point, Belfast City Council doesn't have a network of community forums, general community forums, or any sort of place where people can go to make their views known. They have to go to their councillor. They don't have area forums or anything like that. So if you actually want to have a consultation system within Belfast City Council, and that's on an ongoing long-term basis, then that's an example of what you could do. Otherwise, I think a lot of people's experience at Belfast City Council is having things done to them, and equally the same with the services run by the Assembly. And if people are used to having things done to them, then they're not going to be particularly keen on changing their behaviour.
I think it's one for you, Debbie. I mean, how do you, other than working at the council, how do you make sure that Belfast is with you as climate commissioner?
No, it's really important. I think you made some really valid points there. Just in terms of, there is a community planning partnership across the council, and there's 4 boards. I co-chair one of the boards, the Resilience and Sustainability Board, and on the board we have the East Area Partnership and the West Area Partnership. So the area partnerships are kind of part of the community planning partnership, but it doesn't. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't sort of go down into sort of a more kind of grassroots level outreach. Certainly not from on the climate front anyway, because we're a team of like 6 at the moment, so we're not like the planning department where you have like hundreds of people. That's another issue. But so it is an issue of capacity for our team anyway to kind of create that sort of outreach. That's why we kind of rely on the area partnerships and the voluntary sector panel are also represented on our board as well. In fact, they're represented on all boards.
This actually means that because no one reads leaflets, people don't want to go to meetings. Like, how do you actually get people engaged in a meaningful way? I mean, it's not easy, is it? I wouldn't go to this meeting if I didn't have to. It's the same thing. Just like
You're right. I mean,
the kids are screaming. It's just a lot to do, isn't it?
It is. It's a lot to ask.
Judging everyone here.
It's a lot to ask. So people want to give up their time, and then people don't want to be lectured either. And I think a lot of people do feel really lectured on the climate front, because the kind of the visible side of it is the activism side, and people do feel that they're being chastised all the time. That's why I kind of think it's I kind of prefer to kind of focus on the opportunity and the job creation that can go along with that, and how we can take communities forward through, you know, a series of benefits and that kind of growth that you get when you create all that kind of those opportunities and that innovation and all the R&D that could be coming our way. And
yeah, because I mean, like when people object, there's even conspiracy theories, aren't there, about the 15-minute cities or something. There was even some. This is the thing in Oxford. I don't even know what the conspiracy theory is, but apparently the global Illuminati is coming to take your car away, presumably. So this is what happens when people are triggered in a way. The way they don't feel involved, and they do feel this is an imposition and a negative imposition as well.
You've got the not zero,
right?
You know, community now and
is that a thing? Is it not zero?
Not zero, yeah. I mean, if you tune into GB News, you'll hear
which
a
I
lot
don't.
about
I don't tend to do on a regular basis.
Actually, it's well worth it just for a night, just to see what. But there is a growing band of support for that. So we do need to counter that, and we do need to come up with a positive message, and we do need to. I totally agree. We do need to sort out how we kind of get that outreach working in a much more positive way.
Yes, please, over there.
Hi. I think, Amanda, you touched upon the point of accessibility and about the amazing work that's being done at a community level. But I feel that it's like, as you say, pushing up the hill, and that push is getting harder. And sometimes I think you were being gracious to some of your colleagues saying that they don't really understand. I think it's in their interests to not push ahead when we look at what's happening, and I'm not going to mention particular projects or whatever, but you know, think about the profits of the, you know, Shell and BP and all of that that's happening. And whilst the community and individuals are pushing so hard, we now are battling a system that is actually trying to criminalise the people that are fighting for our planet. And it feels like it's getting harder. And all the things that we all agree on, you know, the basics, cycle lanes, you know, a transport system, why is that not happening? I mean, we as individuals can't create it. It has to come from the top down, as well as obviously the community coming together. And it feels so frustrating because there's so much agreement on what needs to be done. It's just not happening.
It's when you ask the question about how you get people in community, obviously is incredibly important, and things need to be designed and the community. But a key factor is also political leadership and bravery. So I think that we should just pedestrianise all of Belfast city centre, set a date, and we work towards it, because people don't like change. But once it happens, they get used to it, you know, so you do things to help people get ready for that change. I think there is a balance of taking people, community groups, just individuals, everyone's concerns seriously and listening to them. But also, if you were elected and you have a mandate, your job is to make the difficult decisions, because that's what you were elected to do. So there are certain things that we just have to put in place. The fact that we don't have cycle lanes, the fact that they just randomly will build one to placate people, but it stops in the middle of the road and there's a bus stop in it, or don't get me started on the Ravenhill Road cycling down that. There's so many kind of thoughtless, they're just gestures, and there's not long-term thinking. And that's part of the problem of our government is this constant threat of it collapsing, always paying to elections. There's no bravery and there's no long-term thinking, and we need more of that. So we do need to engage with communities more. We need to do more of the bold division work. I mean, that is class, and I think that's how you get people involved and coming to meetings and thinking about things. When you present Belfast as an exciting, connected city where you can use the lagoon, where there's cycle lanes everywhere, where there's green space, where children can play in the city centre, where people are living in the city centre, that's class. That's something that I want. And when you sell that vision and you talk to people about it, then they buy into it. So it's the balance of vision and listening and engaging, but it's also, we know the evidence, we know what we need to do. If you want the planet to continue to exist in the way it is and not have loads of people kind of moving here because there's nowhere else, and you know, there's so many things that we need to do, and that is at the end goal, always has to be in mind. So I think it's that balance.
Amanda.
Yeah, absolutely. Maria, is it? Yeah, hi Maria. Good to see you.
I'm stalking you.
Hey, well, Ditto. Mutual Appreciation Club. Maria, they're really great points, and building on what Kate has said as well. You know, we face real challenge that we do have structural dependency on fossil fuels and combine that with power dynamics and vested interests, like the groups that you've mentioned, such as Shell and others, who keep declaring billions and increasing profits every year, while our most vulnerable communities are having to choose between heating or eating. And I think there's a piece there, Kate, you were talking about bravery and bolder visions. There's a piece about sometimes our politicians need to be more critical and need to fight for our basic rights. So the right for everybody to be able to have a warm home, to have basic rights to feed themselves, to be able to protest when our planet is burning. And that's what an issue. And I don't see enough politicians coming out there. It's really frightening what we're seeing happen in the UK when Extinction Rebellion protesters, among others, are being completely, some are facing significant jail terms for doing for engaging in non-violent direct action to try and provoke wider awareness of climate crisis and instigate action. So I think our politicians have to take a stronger role in that, to protect our rights as citizens, to recognise that bold actions are needed, both in terms of political thinking and action. But we have to challenge a system that is perpetuating climate breakdown and is maintaining inequalities and is deepening inequalities. Like you're talking about migration. We know that with every bit of temperature increases, hundreds of millions of people across the world's livelihoods are being damaged. Research by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change highlights that if we can limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius as opposed to 2 degrees, we can prevent hundreds of millions of people falling deeper into poverty and experience social disadvantage. Hundreds of millions of people's lives can be improved by climate action. So there's these intersectional issues that require attention, and we need our politicians to understand these and take action, but also we all have to be brave and recognise when we take action, we might be penalised for it, but we still have to be brave ourselves and take action across different domains that are necessary.
Thank you. No, I feel like I'm talking. Yeah, that's fine.
Hi guys, nice to see you all talking on the stage. No, it's just I just kind of want to make like a bit of an extraneous point and then move it around into the circle of what we're talking about. And so to kind of follow on from what everyone was talking about, it's about the action now, but I think there's equal importance to focus on what is stopping that action taking place. And I'm just out of teaching some of my students about a pervasive computing course, and we had to delve into the social dynamic, the Netflix documentary, and it's basically saying that billions of people around the world are being neurochemically hacked or influenced or manipulated by the algorithms that permeate society, and very little amount of people realise how entrenched they are with that. But one indicator would be like screen time usage and things like that, how much time of people's precious time they spend endlessly scrolling or mindlessly doing things that don't progress anything. So in my mind, that time, those hours per day on average by everyone around the world, to be very useful to tap into. And of course we look towards the giant tech companies and the politicians to kind of regulate that for us, and of course that is what we need more of. But I think even when it comes down to the fossil fuels, not only to heat our homes and to provide societal assistance, it comes down to our clothes, it comes down to our food, or our food wrapped in. And so if people can understand chemical inputs or the physical inputs they are surrounded by on a daily basis, then maybe they'll have a better ability to control those chemicals that are going into the body, because we all know these recent facts about the nanoplastics now going into the blood-brain barrier, which is like, it's caused for so many different concerns, and it's like there's no direct solution towards that now apart from reduction and the kind of funneling down of consumerism. And I think one kind of good precedent that we kind of touched on would be, it's kind of there's a silver lining to it, but the COVID lockdowns that kind of showed us what it's like to kind of stop everything for a moment. And whether that was for good or for bad, it at least showed us what the positive outcomes that nature did immediately, and it kind of taught people immediately about their human connections to their families and things like this. So yeah, I just wondered what your point or your kind of thoughts on in terms of these chemical imbalances that people are constantly being put by, whether it be caffeine, like the daily caffeine consumption and all that. So That's kind of like
You
my-
can't take my coffee away. You can take TikTok, but you can't take your coffee. I take your point though. I mean, that's the whole sort of rise of screens and internet is a kind of example of a sort of techno-social transition, if you like, which comes about without anybody voting for it, but it's just a sort of this enormous shift in everybody's lives and lifestyles, which has completely transformed society, and I'm sure does affect us in a very directly physical way. There's a lot of evidence now of teen depression, suicides, things like that, which seems to correlate quite strongly with the invention of the smartphone, basically, and the targeting of these algorithms to particularly young audiences. So, you want to say something?
I just want to tell you really quickly about Luddite clubs. Have you heard about this in schools? I read this article in America that these teenagers who are rebelling against the smartphone, they've gone back to the brick Nokia 3310s, and they have these clubs which they call Luddite Club, and they come into the club and they put their phones down and then they just draw and read and do puzzles for an hour. So maybe we're moving into the next phase. I hope so.
But I guess the point is that change is constant and maybe even accelerating, and people will. I mean, like 20 years ago, this room would have been full of smoke with all of ashtrays, and now there's such a thought is just inconceivable. And I don't remember. I mean, I remember it happening very quickly. I remember Scotland introducing a smoking ban, and then England. I don't know when it came here, but then suddenly it was over, and everyone was like, "Oh, I'll never accept this. I'm going to carry on smoking," and no one did. And so it was like it was almost like a tipping point thing, where you get enough enough of an adoption rate, particularly because it's mandated. So this is why I think the political level is absolutely crucial. You can't just have bottom up, even though it's absolutely essential that people are involved in a very meaningful way. But you have to have a national or even international change in the politics. We've got net zero targets now at a country level across 85% of the global economy potentially. Even India, net zero might be 2070, but previously there was going to be increasing fossil fuels right to the end of the century, and the same for China and all of the big emitters. So that's what's made the difference over my career as a climate activist writer, from the 5 degrees to at least the 2 degrees, which is a big difference. It's still pretty bad. I mean, it still does mean parts of the globe become uninhabitable. We lose coral reefs, Arctic sea ice, and so on. But it doesn't take us into turning into Venus. So, the question is how you carry on accelerating that change, I think, right? And do you think? I mean, you were sort of like communities, top level politics. Is there some kind of tension here, or is it a case of just both and?
No. I mean, I think the example of real success was community and politicians coming together to deliver that legislation. So no, I think they go hand in hand, and we need that. We actually need a little bit of tension to get us to keep.
Yeah, but you're not missing in action at the moment. That's not your fault personally in any way.
It's
but
not my fault.
How can that?
No, I mean, we need to reform. We need to reform the institutions. You can't keep having this. So fingers crossed there's a little bit of hope on the horizon, and we do get back up sooner than later. The Assembly has been down as many times as it's been up, and I suppose back to the cities. And it's a thing next door in COP26. We're used to acting in the absence of the Assembly and other people carrying the weight. So we will keep doing the climate action that's needed, but hopefully we'll change that so that the Assembly can play its full part.
Yeah, I mean, that used to be the case during the Trump administration, that the mayors all got together in all the different cities and said, right, in the absence of any federal climate action, we will at least try and do things at the state level, at the city level, at the community level. And then I suppose all of that action was then in place, that when you did have a democratic president, things could move much more rapidly and with a much higher degree of political support. So I guess they do absolutely essentially depend on each other. Any other? We need to wrap up fairly soon, gentlemen there.
Can I just say that I think personal and public awareness of the problem is very important. You mentioned there earlier 150 different organisations, but our population is roughly 2 million. If you can get 2 million people nudging the thing along, we will achieve far more than organisations can do. And people tend to think, oh, such and such an organisation is looking after this, and I'll not do anything. You have to start from the bottom, and individuals, and possibly it's education, bring them up through it, is the thing the whole way. But personal awareness, I think, is the thing. Can also say the agricultural community. Agricultural people have been aware for a long time that the thing has been going wrong.
Absolutely.
But it has been driven by money, and money coming from the department.
Yeah.
If the department would stop pushing the money to particular things, the whole abuse and the growth of massive farms would stop, and the abuse that's coming from. Can I also say, you say about how good Belfast City Council has been. Not all councils are the same.
No, that's true.
Intermediate and Abbey Council, if you're a persistent complainer, you can only do it through their barrister. They will deny you the right to thing, or else they'll give you the runabout and you'll speak to them about it. We have to get that changed, that people have the right to speak up and to listen. Thank you.
Definitely. We sort of need to draw things together. Are there anybody else waiting to come in, or should we? If there isn't, why don't the three of you address that gentleman's point and anything else that's come up, and we'll sort of wrap things up from there.
Okay.
How's that work?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah. Okay, well, I just wanted to say I completely agree. The focus of when I met with the Department of Agriculture, Education, Rural Affairs Committee clerk, he told me that the focus of the committee, when it gets up and running, is really going to be around future agricultural payments, because we know that you've got to put money in, and of course farmers understand that they're custodians of the land, they understand land better than everyone, but you have to put the money in there to make a difference, and there's real room to help people with the rewilding. And I also take your point around councils. I think that Belfast City Council is exemplary, and what I've tried to do with the all-party group on climate action is to invite the different council representatives. So there's the chair of the committee in Belfast City Council who attends the meeting. We want all the different chairs from the different councils across Northern Ireland to attend the all-party group on climate action. And our hope is very much that the all-party group acts as the umbrella, but then the different councils are feeding in the work that they're doing, but also getting inspiration from what everyone else is doing and then feeding that out. So that there's work ongoing there, but we know that we need to do more of it. And that's all I really had to say on that.
Thank you. Debbie.
Yeah, I don't have that much more to add. I mean, it's just, I think it's really important that people do have access to their councils, and it's quite shocking to hear that in some areas people don't have that level of access.